Okay, everybody, let's get started with inspiration and education and humor and participation. All right, well, so, Urantia book. What is it all about? Can it be trusted? What are its main tenets? And is this some kind of a new story, some kind of a new myth, a new description of reality? Or is it metaphor, or a better metaphor, an updated symbol of who we are, what we are, where we are? So let's start with a little bit of some just more factual overview of the Urantia book, since our objective here is Urantia book education. But when we say, or when I say Urantia book, I mean in the broad sense, not just some words on paper, but also the spirit of this text. And the spirit of it goes beyond it, and that's why we define this, or we call this conference Urantia Book and Beyond, because we're not stuck in the text. We're not doctrinaire about this thing, and also the text is full of ambiguous passages. So it is subject to interpretation. So it's what's on the page and what's beyond it, that being your imagination, your interpretation, and that being this community which is growing, which has a discourse among itself, if you know what I mean, as to what this is all about. And then beyond that are other revelations that some claim to have about this teaching. And we'll get to that actually tomorrow mainly. Some key facts. A lot of you know these things, many of you don't, so let's go over it real quick. This book was received in a quasi-mysterious way for over a period of 21 years in Chicago, to a group that had two parts of it. There was a group called the Contact Commission of 6 people, and then there was a larger group called the Forum, and the Forum was convened by the Contact Commission. That was up to 400 people. These papers would appear in some fashion. Then the Forum would read the papers and feed questions from the 6 people in the Contact Commission who had a kind of contact with these celestials. And you can think of it the way Edgar Cayce had his contact. The contact person, we call him the contact personality, was fully asleep, and through him statements would be made. However, there were other forms of contact we'll get to in a minute through him. So there's all these printings. I don't even know how many printings anymore. There's 196 chapters or papers, a lot of pages, and 4 big parts. A lot of people don't know that the Urantia book was copyrighted by the original publishers, and at some point it came out in court that there was no author. They could not produce evidence of an author. And they spent a lot of money, in the 7 figures, defending it, because they felt they were defending a revelation to the planet. And the other side spent a lot of money too. And it went to the Court of 7th Circuit or something, Court of Appeals, and they struck down the copyright saying you haven't produced an author. So there's no author. That's why there's no names on it. The translations are a very important part of this. The translations are multiple, almost all the major languages. Chinese is coming up, Arabic is coming up, and all the European languages. So just a quick overview of some of the main tenets before we get into a little bit more substance on the question of this universe. We've already seen that there are galaxies that are inhabited and galaxies that are not inhabited. So the inhabited galaxies are in the inner band that we saw in that illustration. And the outer galaxies are not yet inhabited, but there's a total of roughly 7 trillion inhabited worlds with humanoid beings, 7 trillion. The spirituality of the Urantia book is what we might call an evolutionary spirituality, and you evolve a soul. The soul is an evolutionary aspect of who you are, and it evolves by your decisions, by your convictions, by your experiences, and it's actually a storehouse for your experiences. The soul stores who you really are in your best and highest decisions leading to your experiences, which are literally like recorded as the soul. We'll get into that a lot more later. Another huge part of the Urantia book is a revelation about the indwelling spirit. So the notion of the indwelling spirit, which you may know from Quakerism, for example, there's a divine spark within. Actually, in the original Greek, some of the original Greek Gnostic texts, they talk about the spirit within, the pneuma in Greek. And the Urantia book has a major revelation about the nature of this indwelling spirit. And it has an odd word for it. It's called the thought adjuster. We'll get into that more. The philosophy of the Urantia book is maybe my favorite part because it's so brilliantly and articulately presented. It's a holistic, integral philosophy of joining truth, beauty, and goodness in your experience, but also as a way of painting a canvas of all reality. All of reality and all of evolution is an evolution of the values of truth, beauty, and goodness, which actually are the components of love. The theology of the Urantia book is theistic. It also is non-dual at the same time. So in the kind of dispute here in Marin County between non-dualism and theists, the Urantia book is a both and. In the Urantia book, God is an absolute, but also God is evolutionary. There's two sides to the deity. One is existential, and the other is experiential evolutionary. The afterlife, according to the Urantia book, is a major part of everything because the universe is set up so that we ascend. It's what we call an ascension cosmology. We're ascending through spheres, through higher and higher levels. More on that later. In history, the Urantia book is also a lot of revelations here. It's a major revelation about human history, particularly prehistory, the prehistory of from way back up to Sumerian times, so what we call pre-Sumerian history, which we'll get into more. Also, very important, really central, is that the Urantia book is complicated and difficult for many reasons, but one reason is it tells the story heretofore not really understood about an angelic rebellion that marred and scarred our planet in far distant times. In politics, the Urantia book is an advocate of world unity, world federation. Way before its time, it was talking about a United Nations kind of federation, and it says that humanity is sovereign. Humanity as humanity is sovereign over the planet. In regard to Jesus, many of you know that the fourth part of the Urantia book is the purported life and teachings of Jesus according to the angelic record. So that's pretty controversial, and a lot of Christians have had trouble with that. And I'll tell you, as a student of the Bible, I love the Bible accounts. I think they're amazing and beautiful, and have a literary quality that's very attractive. The Urantia book's version of the Gospels, you might say, is 700 pages, so you're getting a lot more information, and we'll talk about it some more. I think you came in late. We're only taking questions at the microphone. Yeah, don't worry about it, though. I'll answer that. The way the Urantia book came through is everyone's going to ask, so I'll answer that. The Urantia book is a product of a fairly mysterious process. There are books written about how it came through. It is not routine channeling at all. It is believed by some that these chapters materialized. It was direct materialization. And others dispute that. So we don't have the facts. And there's a book coming out soon that has yet another version because the people that received it were given a mandate to just, it's not important how it came through. We want people to look at the literary quality of the text and not really orient to how it came through. However, we all want to know how it came through. So I don't agree with that. I think we do want to know. And so generally, let's say it's a mysterious process, and there were many parts of it. There were direct contact with celestial beings that was auditory. There was materializations, very likely, and some combinations of these where people did automatic writing. but the text itself is not a product of automatic writing. And if you examine the literary quality of this, and I'm an editor and a book publisher, it's impossible for somebody to channel something with perfect grammar and perfect use of vocabulary that's consistent for 2,000 pages. It just can't happen. It can't come through the human mind that way. So that's why most of us consider it to be sort of a miraculous appearance. I just want to read you and just give you a sense of the quality of some of the language. And some of this language is complicated, and so this is what you're in for if you read it, if you haven't read it yet. So this is the opening words. In the minds of the mortals of Urantia, that being the name of your world, there exists great confusion respecting the meaning of such terms as God, divinity, and deity. Human beings are still more confused and uncertain about the relationships of the divine personalities that are designated by these numerous appellations. Because of this conceptual poverty associated with so much ideational confusion, I have been directed to formulate this introductory statement by the Orvanton Corps of Truth Revealers. So who are these truth revealers? They purportedly hail from the center of our, what we call the super universe, which was represented in the film as one galaxy, but that's an artist's representation. It's actually not one galaxy. It is a cluster of galaxies, and I think Phil said it was 100,000, wherever you are, Phil, 100,000 galaxies in the local cluster. Remember the name of the cluster? I forget. Sagittarius? And it was a cluster of galaxies. So these beings come from the center of this unit to their revelators, and we call them the revelators. Now, kind of jumping in with both feet into substantive teachings. According to the Urantia book and my interpretation, our chief difficulty is that in prehistoric times we had a calamity, and I call it our transhuman history, actually. It's kind of superhuman history, and destiny have been lost. And the source of this difficulty is an angelic rebellion that we mentioned, and there was what we call a double default. And that will be defined, so kind of keep that in mind. There was a double default in our prehistory. A little bit on the core spiritual teachings. I'm weaving topics in various directions to try to give you a holistic picture. So these are key spiritual teachings. God indwells each of us and loves us beyond all measure. I will read all the words up there, so you don't have to be reading and listening. So just know that I'm reading the words. God is our divine Father and Mother. Important contribution of the Urantia book is the motherhood of God as well as the fatherhood of God. Love God and others as yourself, the golden rule. Soul evolution and ascension. We have an eternal life of love and service ahead of us. And finally, the universe is evolutionary. The finite aspect of God evolves with and as us. Again, these are my interpretations. According to the Urantia book, there's a supreme adventure that not only we are on, but all beings on all planets. And so when they say planets, they mean billions, actually trillions of planets, of humanoid beings that look like us, but not all of them look like us. The sublime search for the God of universes is the supreme adventure of the inhabitants of all inhabited worlds. Their definition of faith I find liberating. And they actually say faith liberates. Their definition of belief is interesting. Belief is always limiting and binding. Faith is expanding and releasing. Here's my, I think, favorite passage. Belief fixates, faith liberates. Belief fixates, faith liberates. It is a living experience concerned with spiritual meanings, divine ideals, and supreme values. I have never seen a definition of faith like the one you get in the Urantia book, and there's whole chapters, whole sections on faith. So this is just one little statement among many. So the parts of the Urantia book. 4 big parts. First part, part 1, is central and super universes. So this is the cosmology section. Part 2 is on the local universe. So in the Urantia book, you have these big galaxies that are inhabited, and then you have local sections of the galaxies that are administrative units. So part 2 is about that, and that is all revelatory. There's really nothing like it. Part 3 is the history of our planet, Urantia. Part 4, life and teachings of Jesus. So, Urantia is the celestial name of our planet. It seems like people should know that. There are things in the Urantia book that are what I call spiritually incorrect, especially in Marin County. So, the Urantia book uses language which today we may consider to be patriarchal language. So, bear in mind as you go through it that it comes through in a different era, in a different generation, before we had feminism, before we had the current movement toward liberating women from centuries of oppression in religion. So its language actually straddles both generations. There's what you might call feminist theology in the Urantia book, but there's also more conservative language. So they intentionally, I think, bridge that because the group they were working with in the 20s and 30s, I mentioned 20s and 30s is when this was coming through, was so totally overwhelmed by the text that they couldn't do, 1990s style, mentality for them. It was already completely too much for them. So don't expect too much of it, but I mean, you're still getting an awful lot of revelatory material. So God is a father, but also God is a mother. But they use father language a lot. Also, politically incorrect is the notion that the divine is personal. And these days, at least around here, the divine is not seen as personal, unless you might happen to be a bhakti practitioner in Hinduism. But generally, we, these days, seemingly think of God as a great force or divine energy, but we don't think of God as personally interested in us. So we have removed, we being the postmodern generation, we've removed this Christian notion of a loving God who watches over us and corrects us. We rebelled against that, and we didn't want to think of God as personal, but the Urantia book reinstates that at a much higher level. Also, it seems to be politically incorrect, unless you're living in the Midwest, to think of Jesus as incarnate God. But the Urantia book reinstates that at a much higher level of understanding. Also, in many circles, including I'm in a men's group, where every one of the men in the men's group believes that they have reincarnated many times. But the Urantia book actually does not affirm reincarnation in the kind of Hindu sense. It has a technical meaning for that, but it does not affirm the idea that all of us had past lives and that we're going through these different lives until we get off the wheel and then we can go somewhere else. It's a whole different cosmology. But there are, what I believe in my interpretation, are reincarnation aspects, but I call them technical. Finally, philosophic spirituality. You're supposed to have your spirituality, and it's not supposed to be mental. It's supposed to be not very cognitive, right? It's supposed to be sort of going with the flow. But the Urantia book certainly has that aspect, but it's also very philosophic. So we used to say people are either philosophic or they're sub-philosophic. And this is how so when we were introducing Urantia book to people years ago, if somebody was sub-philosophic, we probably wouldn't even introduce them to it because they wouldn't like it, because it's cognitive. It's giving you philosophic underpinning for its theology, for its spirituality, for everything. And so it is truly philosophic, and there are a lot of philosophers who have spent their life looking at the philosophy of the Urantia book, and we're going to have one in about a short time from now. It's going to be speaking to us. Now, politically incorrect. The Urantia book is amazing in that it has a revelation about race evolution, and we're not going to cover too much of that except today at 4 p.m. And the evolution of races from an early, very, very early time that is all new in the Urantia book. They do differ genetically, and they blend over time so that the differences are unimportant. However, in our case, we had, remember the double default? We had a double default, so we did not get to have the opportunity for race blending, which normal planets do. We'll get to that later. Second, politically incorrect, that Satan is a real being. So for most of us, we would think that's a fundamentalist position, and we don't believe in things like that. But the Urantia book says there was such a person and also such a person as Lucifer, and we're going to hear a lot about them later on. And they were the perpetrators of the angelic rebellion, and we'll get to that more. Atlantis, according to the Urantia book, they don't use the term Atlantis, but there's something that I call Atlantis, because I published a book about it, is the Garden of Eden is the same thing as Atlantis. And believe it or not, it's located in Cyprus, but it mainly sunk beneath the ocean. And I mentioned Democratic World Federation is a teaching of the Urantia book right now that's not in favor. A little bit more on that. This is a book that I co-authored about that part of the Urantia book. It's on the notion of citizenship, but it's global citizenship that's all over the place in the Urantia book. Also, they talk about universe citizenship. The Urantia book is, some think it's socialistic in its teaching. It certainly is not praising the profit motive, but it says you can't remove the profit motive until people are ready. It puts this family at the center, not just here, but on all planets, and universally, the family is at the center of social and political life. There's a new teaching on social sustainability that is, we're going to talk about more tomorrow. Also, depicts Jesus as favoring a unified world and world federation. It's very radical. This is something we're going to, again, talk about tomorrow, just showing it to you just as a little hint. Just quickly, there are some major artists who secretly read the Urantia book, and here's two examples. Here's another one. He lives locally, and I'm trying to reach him. Also, we found out through an acquaintance of mine who's a special ops soldier who was decorated in the Oval Office, and he saw a Urantia book open on Bill Clinton's desk. It was at coffee stains, it was dog-eared, and that's the story. I won't read it to you. This same guy went back to the Oval Office and talked to Clinton twice, second time also. Some of you may know this wonderful singer and songwriter. He's changed his career, is now a Urantia minister. I'm going to run you through a few of these, what I call amazing factoids. For example, about Jesus. You know, the Bible, Jesus ascends to heaven, and he is at the right hand of the Father. And the Trinity is male, and then there's the Holy Spirit. We're not sure what that is. But in the Urantia book, there's this intervening level, which is the local universe deities are male-female. So that's the first amazing factoid. So there's a deity spouse of Jesus called Mother Spirit. The two of them created a local universe. They're creator beings. So in Christian theology, it's often seen that Christ is a creator, and the Urantia book says that as well. But he has a co-equal creator, and they created the local universe working with other beings, but they're the source of life and of the patterns of life, the two of them together. We don't have 10 million inhabited planets. Jerry, you always know that number. What is it? How many? 3,800,000 local planets so far, in counting, but there's inhabitable potential of 10 million local planets. The Urantia book tells a lot of detail about Jesus' early life and his missing years. It says he was also a leather worker and a caravan driver. He had siblings. His father died, and he had to raise the kids as the oldest son. So he had fatherhood experience. He had 8 siblings. And in the Bible, there's, I think, a handful of resurrection appearances, but in the Urantia book, he has 40 resurrection appearances. Here's some more factoids. The universe has a center. That's something very much rejected in today's theology and cosmology. Space is nearly absolute in the Urantia book. Time is not. The central universe, which we saw earlier, it's eternal. It's uncreated. It was not created. It's always been there. There's a whole Big Bang thing we're going to get to this afternoon. We talked about 7 trillion inhabited planets, and we talked about that the universe is like Star Trek, but no warfare.